usually delay and start recording, and then I get to introduce you. All right, you're recording.
Awesome.
Make sure everyone knows that they are being recorded. Okay, let's get going. Well, it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Danielle Zoe Rivera to join us today for this latest installment in the Geographies of Risk special seminar series. And I cold called Dr. Rivera after reading her disaster colonialism article and having it take the top of my head off, and I was thrilled that she said yes. To being to an interview for the podcast, and it was a great conversation. And I continue to think about that work. It comes up all the time for me now, and so I'm really excited that you are here to present for the school, and that this will be up as a resource in the collection of these talks as well. And it's great to have you here. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Eli. And you've been such a wonderful supporter of the piece ever since it came out. So thank you so much for the opportunity to get to speak to you all today. Today, what I wanted to cover first is just some of my background. So I'm a assistant professor of environmental design at the University of Colorado Boulder, where I'm also the director of our Just Environments Lab, which essentially is a group that tries to center issues of justice and equity in all discussions of things, sustainability, climate change, environmental risk. And so that's really the thrust of our lab. So today I'm really going to cover mainly my disaster colonialism piece, which focuses on Puerto Rico. So start off with why Puerto Rico is such a compelling case to study. I'll also talk about how disaster colonialism as a concept comes out of that idea of Puerto Rico as an exceptional case. And then I'll also go beyond Puerto Rico. One of the things we're trying to do is see if disaster colonialism is at work in other contexts. Some others are doing this work. I'll just provide one other case that we've been working on in our lab at the US-Mexico border, and just to provide some initial thoughts about what that is looking like. It's a little less formed than the Puerto Rico work, but I thought it could be interesting for the conversation. So, and everyone's seeing my slides, right? All good. Just wanted to check. Sometimes with Zoom, it likes to stop sharing slides.
We can see. All good.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, so starting with why Puerto Rico. So I should mention where Puerto Rico is and how it's related to the US. So Puerto Rico, you can see down here, is an archipelago of islands, essentially, that are located in the Caribbean Sea. There are about 3 million Puerto Ricans that live on the island itself, and about 5 million that have moved out of the archipelago and into the United States. So technically, when we talk about Puerto Ricans as a whole, as a culture, it's in diaspora. More of them live off the island now, or off the archipelago now, than live in the archipelago. Here you can see I've mapped just a few of the major areas that Puerto Ricans have moved to, mainly, historically New York City and Chicago, but increasingly, particularly after Maria, we see Puerto Ricans moving more to the American South, so Atlanta and all across Florida. And this diaspora is essentially the result of centuries of colonization, first under the Spanish from 1493 to 1898, and then under the United States from 1899 until present. And as a result, the archipelago actually remains one of the oldest, most consistent colonies in existence in the world. So there was only, I believe, 1 year before the US took ownership of the archipelago. There's only 1 year where Puerto Rico actually had self-determination and its own governance. At the time, it was trying to struggle for independence and was looking at other Spanish colonies as a model. Unfortunately, in the Spanish-American War, the Spanish ended up giving Puerto Rico to the US, so they weren't able to get their independence. So this is a very, very old colony, and it has been sort of very much ingrained in Puerto Rican culture and thinking, which we refer to as this idea of coloniality of being, that it's seeped into all aspects of our culture, our thinking, everything. And so working in this region for some time now, it's really fascinated me how many scholars have referred to Puerto Rico as being an exception or some kind of exceptional case given its uncertain status within the US system. It's a commonwealth. I think it's one of the only, perhaps the only territory to actually have that, that designation in the US system. And so it's always seen as being something very different than any other case study you could find in the US. But unfortunately, when they refer to Puerto Rico as an exception or an exceptional case, what we see is that shorthand for a space that does not generate theory. And I think this idea of exceptionalism generates a liminality, whereby certain peoples, regions, and spaces, in this case Puerto Rico, become avenues through which theory can operate and be enacted, but not created. And my concern is that this kind of liminality that we're seeing invites any number of injustices, as endogenous histories and theories in these spaces are then relegated to almost a second-class status within academia. And certainly that we see that happening with sort of indigenous Puerto Rican theories within the larger US academic context. And so a question that a lot of urban scholars right now are asking is if truly anything is liminal. So basically spaces that are considered to be on the edge, are they actually really on the edge of anything? In rendering countries like Puerto Rico liminal, what is truly occurring in academia? What are we really saying about these spaces? So this is why in Puerto Rican studies, for instance, to give an example of how this is transforming our ideas, we veer away from using words like mainland to describe the US. This is a term that historically has, I think, inscribed liminality in Puerto Rico because it sort of institutes a coloniality in the very language we use to describe Puerto Rico's relative positionality geographically to the US. But again, on the question of liminality, I think countless scholars of Mexican American and Puerto Rican studies have really sought to center their histories and theories and cultures instead of seeing them at the edge of something. And I think works like this from Tato Laviera really capture the sentiment. So Tato Laviera is a very well-respected Puerto Rican poet who's living in New York City at the time he wrote this poem. Essentially, ni de aquí ni de allá is Spanish for neither from here nor there. So it's this idea of this uncertain circumstance. And the poem is written to reflect that uncertainty of positionality. So you can see it's written in a mix of English and Spanish, and unless you know Spanglish, it's very hard to read and understand. And so this is basically this idea of the tensions that are caused by Puerto Rican identity. But what I think is so compelling about the poem is that at once it's talking about the tensions between two different spaces, two different cultures, but is also at the same time creating an entirely new space, an entirely new culture where you have to be that interlocutor between, you know, the English and the Spanish in order to actually be able to understand what he's writing here. And I love that in the use of Spanglish, you can see the poem starts to talk, I think, about theory in an interesting way, where he says this space that he's creating is yet to be defined, an evolutionary hybrid. So this idea that there is something to these spaces, but we haven't really identified them fully or really explored them fully.
Danielle, I'm sorry to interrupt. Can we just check to make sure that we're seeing the, so far I can see your title slide, but I'm not sure.
Oh my gosh, yeah, let me see. I was afraid that would happen.
No, it's okay. It's
okay.
There we are. If we change your view, then there we go.
Yeah, sorry about that. I don't know why the full screen's not working.
Okay. Sorry, please continue. I didn't.
Yeah, there you go. No, I'm happy you did that. So let me go back a few slides here. let's see. I'll have to show the navigator. Yes, so I apologize. I had this gorgeous map. That was really what was showing that movement from Puerto Rico into the mainland US. And then also here's the poem that I was just mentioning. So you can see that it is a mix of English and Spanish and how that begins to create that, you know, exceptional space that I was talking about. Yeah, is that working now, Eli?
Yes, thank you. All good now. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, that happens to me in Zoom sometimes, and it's extremely frustrating. I feel so bad when it happens. Okay, so so this work and others is what really has brought me to study Puerto Rico, and also, as I'll describe later, the U.S.-Mexico border. So in this work, I really seek to center the experiences of these spaces that we otherwise view as exceptional or liminal. And by centering their experiences, what we see are the emergence of theories that I think are very critical to our understanding of nature, the environment, and specifically, as I'll talk about today, disaster. So to undertake this work, I borrow very heavily from Indigenous scholarship on disasters, which comes out of the US and Australia as well. Mainly the concepts that they've generated of procedural vulnerability. So procedural vulnerability notes that is the relationship between peoples and the power around them that generates vulnerability in and through disaster, not their relationship to the environment itself. And so this often occurs through needless bureaucratic hurdles in post-disaster recovery and reconstruction, which often leverage the liminality of these peoples and their communities to essentially discriminate against them through that recovery process. Given this, you can see how the history of Puerto Rican disasters highlights a proclivity for these kinds of procedural vulnerabilities. So my team tried to understand how this could work through the history and through the sort of current circumstances in Puerto Rico. So we started by mapping all the named hurricanes. So these are not tropical storms, but these are all the major hurricanes that passed through the archipelago from 1898 until 2017. And what we saw was that Puerto Rico emerged as one of the most hurricane-prone regions in the Atlantic Ocean. It's also one of the most earthquake-prone regions of the northern Atlantic. As we saw earlier this last year, Puerto Rico was experiencing a series of dozens and dozens of major earthquakes, particularly in the southern region here. And specifically for hurricanes, this issue is not expected to slow with climate change, but we anticipate more frequent and more severe hurricanes over the next several decades. So in addition to charting the paths of these storms, we also wanted to understand their relative severity. So we were looking at, historically through this chart, the intensities of these storms over time. And we see that historically there's always been these peaks of intense hurricanes. And I've called out 6 in particular down below there that have figured prominently in Puerto Rican memory. You can really see it in the culture, in the newspaper articles from the time, and just sort of in the memories of Puerto Ricans. And so from this, we really gleaned that every generation in Puerto Rico has that hurricane that really disrupted the archipelago's governance and quality of life at that time and become sort of ingrained in memory. And this can be sort of passed by generation to generation. So we've heard sort of old hurricanes from our parents and our grandparents. For me, it was my grandfather used to recount a story of being home in Arecibo, and a major hurricane came through and it almost blew his home into the Atlantic Ocean. It was a very scary moment in his life for him. And actually that particular storm became cemented in Puerto Rican memory through a famous plena or song, which recounts the fury of Hurricane San Felipe, which struck Puerto Rico in 1928. And so we can see is that these storms leave deep impressions on past generations, and that memory is handed down to future generations. It just so happens that in our time, that storm that's sort of ingrained in our memory is going to be Hurricane Maria. So Hurricane Maria struck in September 2017, and following the concept of procedural vulnerability, what we wanted to understand was what made the storm so disruptive, and not see that as, you know, Puerto Ricans' relationship to the environment, but see it as that disempowerment and continued colonization under the U.S. So what are those markers that we could see, you know, in terms of data to understand that relationship, at least from the initial outset? And what we see is a slow and ineffective disaster response to Hurricane Maria. So what my research team did following Hurricane Maria for 3 months, we would go to the Puerto Rican government. They were doing daily updates of all the infrastructure across the island. But the problem is there's a lot of lack of transparency in government data there. They would highlight the day's statistics, but they would at the same time remove the previous day's statistics. So we just kept track of all the information over 3 months in order to have a data set of what actually happened. And so here you can see this was access to electricity after Hurricane Maria. And about 2 months after the storm, only 50% of the island had electricity. And for those who did have power, that power was still really unreliable, would cut out, there were rolling blackouts. Even till today, these blackouts are common. They just had one this past weekend in the capital area. And so this is still a major issue that they're dealing with even 3 years out from the storm. We also examined access to water, and we found similar trends. So a month after the hurricane, nearly 20% of Puerto Ricans still lack potable running water. And this statistic was made even more alarming for us when we broke it down by region in Puerto Rico. So here we see that the north, which is very rural, less connected to the rest of the island, actually suffered lower rates of access to water than the other regions, say like the metro region of the capital, which was able to get water much more quickly. And so these persistent issues in basic infrastructure are a pointed reminder of the U.S.'s decades-long disinvestment in the archipelago, which we feel like was monstrously heightened by hurricanes Irma and Maria in 2017, begging the question, why did this happen? Why was infrastructure so bad? Why was the devastation so bad? And why is it taking so long to have a just and equitable recovery for the residents of Puerto Rico? But in revisiting these past hurricanes and their equally poor, disaster recovery processes, and we saw this happening after all of these hurricanes, the same kinds of trends, really we thought the question at hand is, why does this continue to happen? And so again, not seeing Hurricane Maria as a single sort of incident of disaster, but the disaster studies literature is very much emphasizing today the issue of compounding disasters. And we can see this in Puerto Rico's history and proclivity for hurricane. So to answer this question, I wanted to turn to theories used to explain poor disaster reconstruction in the wakes of Irma and Maria to get to this idea that I proposed of disaster colonialism. So by far, the most extensively employed theory used for understanding the inequitable post-disaster recovery in Puerto Rico is Naomi Klein's concept of disaster capitalism. Disaster capitalism is a critically important concept for describing capitalist interests embedded within disasters and capitalism's propensity for even creating disasters where none exist in order to create profits. While evidence of disaster capitalism is no doubt evident in post-Maria Puerto Rico, I'll show in a second that I think there's a larger experience that's being omitted from this discussion. So looking at how disaster capitalism actually works through Puerto Rico, we can see sort of, at least to provide one example, the idea of opportunity zones, which is a very big planning concept right now in the archipelago. Opportunity zones have long been heralded as an example of disaster colonialism in Puerto Rico. Here you can see all the opportunity zones marked in orange, which is essentially almost the entire space of Puerto Rico, except for very few. About 98% of the archipelago is considered to be an opportunity zone, or essentially an exceptional space where normal taxes don't apply, where businesses can be able to set up factories or other shops more easily than in other places in the US. So this has been considered almost an entirely sort of exceptional space within the US. The previous US administration noted the potential to opportunity zones have the potential to transform some of the most economically underdeveloped parts of the country. This was a statement that many Puerto Ricans did not like. There's this idea in the federal government here that Puerto Rico is in need of some kind of massive economic overhaul, and that even from its inception, introduction into the US system, there's always been this idea of underdevelopment in Puerto Rico, which Puerto Ricans have always lamented, that kind of idea. So the island being burdened with massive municipal and government debt right now, it's in a massive debt crisis. US Congress has disallowed them from declaring bankruptcy. So, you know, like a city like Detroit, Michigan was able to declare bankruptcy to get out from under its debt. The US Congress a few years ago declared that Puerto Rico was not eligible to declare bankruptcy as a commonwealth, as you know, given its colonial status. And so it's been trying to handle and deal with this debt, which then that debt, part of it was obtained legally, part of it, Puerto Ricans point out, was obtained illegally. So some of it is not actual legal debt. But regardless, the net effect is that this debt has allowed the US government to declare this space as in crisis, an economic crisis, and then allowed the federal government to pass PROMESA. PROMESA is a very controversial act which allows a federal oversight board. Any government decision right now in Puerto Rico has to pass through PROMESA, and this unelected board is able to determine whether that's any law or zoning change or anything, whether that's actually good for Puerto Rico or not. So it's essentially what Puerto Ricans believe is a colonial oversight board. And so from this, we see the opportunity zones, Puerto Rico's debt, all of this together. PROMESA, I think, forms a very strong example of disaster capitalism. But I think there's still something missing even from this explanation relative to Puerto Rico's history. And so when we look at the Battle for Paradise, if you have read it, if you're interested in Puerto Rico and haven't read this, you really should. It's a very small book, but very powerful. Basically, the Battle for Paradise was written very hastily after Hurricane Maria by Naomi Klein. Within several months of the hurricane, it was published. And so as a result, it doesn't engage Puerto Rico's history beyond the 21st century. Therefore, it doesn't really engage Puerto Rico's history of disasters. Hurricane Maria was really one of the first major hurricanes in the 21st century. So by not really going beyond the 21st century and looking at Puerto Rico's history more generally, what we see is that Klein ends up attributing the poor disaster recovery and reconstruction to Puerto Rico's debt and its economic crisis, and not to its long-standing history of colonization. So this is where my idea of disaster colonialism comes into play. What I think is really missing in this dominant narrative of Puerto Rico's poor recovery after Maria is the idea that capitalism and colonialism, since the beginning, since their inceptions, have been intertwined in theory. So this is a really common framework. If you look at Latin American studies, scholars like Nelson Maldonado Torres, Anibal Quijano, and others all talk about this intricate relationship between capitalism and colonialism in and across Latin America and the Caribbean. And they trace that connection all the way back to colonialism's inception in the Caribbean. So this is the long-standing relationship between these two. So this idea of disaster capitalism then has basically an over-reliance on frameworks of capitalism to the detriment of understanding how colonialism also operates through disaster. And stressing the relational issues at hand, we really can't ignore the role that colonization has played in post-disaster recovery in places like Puerto Rico. So to recognize this, I proposed the concept of disaster colonialism and how colonization operates through disaster. So in my recent IDRO piece, which was published back in September 2020, I defined disaster colonialism as the specific mechanisms used to leverage repeatedly poor disaster recovery for the purposes of furthering inequities. In the case of Puerto Rico, these mechanisms specifically involve their colonial status under the Spanish first and then now under the US. And so in this vein, disaster colonialism is, in my mind, specifically related to procedural vulnerability, in the sense that we don't want to make the discussion about Puerto Rico's connections to their environment, but understand that what they're experiencing now is a relational issue stemming from power imbalances, specifically their coloniality. This framing of disaster colonialism is actually built upon an endogenous indigenous idea within Puerto Rican theory of environmental colonialism. So for me, I think the concept of disaster colonialism came even more out of my readings in this area than even responding to disaster capitalism, interestingly enough. So environmental colonialism was first discussed in the 1970s and 1980s by Puerto Rican scholars like Tomás Morales Cardona and Carmen Concepcion, basically seeing environmental colonialism as a very, very early form of environmental justice, which stretches all the way back to the 1960s in Puerto Rico. So a very interesting movement. It wasn't a scholarly movement. It was a very sort of practice-based organizing movement. Specifically, the works on environmental colonialism names colonization as the driving force behind Puerto Rico's overburden of environmental risk. And we see these overburdens of environmental risk in things like current toxic coal ash dumping. So coal ash has been shown to cause all kinds of cancers. It leaches into the water system and from there can cause cancer rates to spike. And the US has been basically sending their coal ash from the American South and burying it in southern Puerto Rico, causing environmental and health disaster there. We also can see evidence of environmental colonialism historically in Vieques. Vieques is a smaller island off the main island in the archipelago. Vieques used to be home to the US Navy. Half the island was a Navy base. And the Navy used Vieques as a sort of experimentation ground for all kinds of bombs. And so they were just constantly bombing the island. Eventually, Puerto Ricans were able to organize to get the Navy to leave Vieques, but the environmental issues from that bombing still exist. And this has been pointed to as an example of environmental colonization or colonialism. So, in examining the histories of disaster and reconstruction in Puerto Rico, we can see similar trends of disaster colonialism, sort of taking this idea of environmental colonialism and really expanding it to disasters and not just to localized issues of pollution. It's important to note that disaster colonialism does involve, but really does extend beyond this issue of lack of disaster aid or disaster response. So it's not just the merely withholding disaster aid, but includes a number of other techniques that we've seen after other storms that I'll go through right now, actually. And so one of these other issues, in addition to disaster aid and response, we've seen issues of the criminalization of indigenous weather tracking methods and knowledge. And so in his extensive work on Puerto Rican environmental history, Stuart Schwartz in particular, I love Stuart Schwartz's work, he describes the criminalization of indigenous Taíno weather tracking methods. So the Taino were the indigenous members of what is now Puerto Rico or Hispaniola or Cuba, that sort of area of the Caribbean. The Taino had very advanced weather tracking methods. They could actually sense that a hurricane was approaching just by looking at the movement of the wind and the rain and the water in the ocean. They could sense it before it made landfall, sometimes 4 days in advance. These systems of tracking the weather and the movement of the waves were cast as witchcraft under the Spanish and had penalties of death associated with them. So unfortunately for the Taino, they could sense that a hurricane was coming, but were afraid to tell the Spanish because they could be executed. So there was that criminalization there of that kind of knowledge. And so that is one way in which we've seen that kind of issue of disaster colonialism very, very early on, you know, in the 15th, 16th centuries, instituted in Puerto Rico. Also, with US occupation came the introduction of modern weather technology to Puerto Rico. And what happened was, as soon as these weather technologies were introduced to the archipelago, and the US had that foothold in the Caribbean now, which it hadn't before, it began to ask neighboring countries like Haiti and the Dominican Republic to actually accept their modern weather-related technologies, different weather towers, that kind of technology, in order to have a broader sense of what was happening weather-wise in the Caribbean. A lot of these nations at first were uncomfortable with this technology and declined to have these weather towers in their territories. And what happened was, unfortunately, the US said, fine, we won't share our knowledge with you then. And so unfortunately, there was a series of hurricanes in the early 20th century. Obviously, it caused a lot of devastation, unfortunately, in Haiti, where the US was not sharing that knowledge. And eventually Haiti complied and said, fine, like, you can install that tower on our land. And so this was another way of seeing disaster colonialism, not just in Puerto Rico, but also having effects on neighboring Caribbean nations as well. And then lastly, I just want to mention here that there is an extensive history that we've seen in, newspaper articles covering hurricanes to government documents from the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, who's responsible in the US for taking care of disaster issues. We've seen in all of this communications inherent anti-Black and anti-Indigenous messaging within these different agencies. So this was meant to signal who was or wasn't deserving in the eyes of the government and the public of any post-disaster aid. And we actually saw this. If you look at Sarah Molinari's work, she's done an amazing job of showing how that history of anti-Black and anti-Indigenous messaging even continues today through Hurricane Maria. So seeing that continuing even till today. But ultimately, disaster capitalism only leads us to identify issues of withholding and misuse of recovery funds. Essentially, disaster capitalism is a theory that was created outside of Puerto Rico. And so as many, many people after Hurricane Maria try to apply this theory to the space of Puerto Rico, what we see is that it's struggling to really map very efficiently to the real history and culture of the archipelago. And so what's omitted from these discussions of what is omitted then are discussions of colonization, of coloniality, of colonization, which really influence every aspect of Puerto Rican culture. In particular, its history of environmental risks, of disasters, and of poor responses to both environmental risk and disaster. So, keeping this in mind, it is important to note that other communities and peoples who've been rendered liminal may also experience some related form or very similar form of disaster colonialism. This is key to note because I certainly don't want people to think that we should see disaster colonialism everywhere, but it is a concept that clearly holds weight in very specific communities, especially those that have been rendered liminal, is what we're finding, at least across other spaces in the US. And so one of the more compelling parallels I found in looking at other communities that may have these similar problems is the US-Mexico border region. And so what I found, so this is the other project that my lab is working on. We are doing a lot of work in the US-Mexico border area. And in looking at the cultural history of the border, we found an exact sort of replica of Tato Laviera's sense of ni de aquí, ni de allá in this idea of Nepantla. And Nepantla is a concept that comes out of Gloria Anzaldua's work. She's very noted and respected scholar in Mexican American culture. She's also a very gifted poet. Nepantla was one of the concepts that came out of her own experience in the US-Mexico border region. Essentially, Nepantla is an indigenous Nahuatl term. Nahuatls were an indigenous peoples who lived in Mexico, but also had influence on the opposite side of the border. Nepantla is essentially Nahuatl for meaning an in-between space or land. And so this idea that somehow this in-between space is significant in some way. And so Anzaldúa likens this idea of Nepantla at the US-Mexico border, where she was raised, as feeling like standing on a bridge. And you have the uncertainty of being on that bridge, right? There's no firm ground beneath you. It's just rushing water. But you can see solid ground to either side of you, but you're occupying this space, this uncertain space between two pieces of land. And so that is essentially what Nepantla is. It's occupying an in-between space. And so Anzaldúa really takes this idea of Nepantla and brings it out geographically to understand how the US-Mexico border is not a line, but actually has a thickness to it and becomes an actual region, its own space. And I love how she describes it here in one of her poems. She says, the US-Mexico border es una herida abierta, or an open wound, where the third world grates against the first and bleeds. And before a scab forms, it hemorrhages again, the lifeblood of two worlds merging to form a third country or a border culture. And it's this border culture that we've been trying to understand. This idea of a third country is very prominent in the US-Mexico border region on both sides of the border. And so here, looking at how this third country actually maps. So we have the space of the actual, border itself. And then off of that, you can see in the dashed blue lines here, we have 150 miles marked out from the border. This is significant because there are several US policies that specify that the border region is actually an area that extends 100 to 150 miles, depending on the policy you're looking at, out from the US-Mexico border. So there's actually almost like a reification of this idea of the third country in a lot of US policies. This is important because the 100 to 150 miles always marks some kind of exceptional space here. So either there are more laws that will apply to this area, or there are laws that could apply elsewhere in the US that don't apply in this region. And so again, like Puerto Rico, we have that idea of that exceptionalism at work at the US-Mexico border. The space that specifically my team looks at in this border region, you can see marked here in blue, is the Rio Grande Valley. I just refer to it as the valley, which is a tri-county region. As you can see here, this is Starr County, Hidalgo County, and Cameron counties in Texas. They border the US-Mexico border, but also the Gulf of Mexico. And so our interest in the valley is that it's a majority Mexican American region, over 90% Mexican American, and also remains one of the poorest regions of the entire continental US. And so it typically does not have services and aid that other parts of the US receive. Interestingly, it was also one of the last parts of Texas to be annexed to the US in the Mexican-American War. And so it has its own culture, and it tends to celebrate that very loudly and proudly. So it's very different even from the rest of Texas. And you can see it's kind of like the tip of the US, so it's very exceptional on multiple levels. What interests us in the Valley is in talking to many of the impoverished communities that live in this area. You can see I've marked them here in black. They're known as the colonias, are the hyper low-income communities within this already very impoverished region. What we're interested in is their repeated risks of tropical storms and hurricanes. Particularly in 2008, there was a very strong hurricane that blew through the Gulf of Mexico and hit this region head on. You can see it actually made landfall in the region. Hurricane Dolly really had a major impact on this region. The low-income low-income communities that I have marked here in black, some of them experienced flooding for over 180 days. There was just stagnant water in these communities. This is a subtropical region, so obviously that standing water was extremely problematic, caused outbreaks of dengue fever and of cholera. And also, we saw massive amounts of damage to the roofs of many homes, which is also very bad in the subtropical region. It introduced all kinds of mold into these homes. And without funding from the government, these homes ended up just sort of lingering with the mold and causing all kinds of health problems for households like asthma. So we saw massive, massive public health issues after this hurricane. And unfortunately, what became clear after Dolly is that any post-disaster assistance from the federal government would not help the community. And so we estimate that about 85% of applications to FEMA's Individuals and Households Assistance Program, which, if you're not familiar with the US context, the Individuals and Households Assistance Program, or IHP, is probably the most common way that a household can get assistance after a natural disaster. About 85% of those applications in the Rio Grande Valley were denied after Hurricane Dolly. So that meant there was a lot of rebuilding and reconstruction that just was not going to happen in this region. This is not a docile community. They're very loud, and they're very proud, and they're very well organized. It's one of the reasons why I love to study them. They have such a vibrant sense of self and of community. And in particular, one group known as Lupe decided to gather little bits of money from the community, $5 from this household, $10 from this household, and were able to sue FEMA for this very high rejection rate. I should mention that this 85% rejection rate is about twice or 3 times the average for this program in the US. So this is a much higher rate than we would normally see in rejections. So Lupe, this community-based organization, noted this and then sued FEMA. It was a nearly 10-year battle, but eventually Lupe was able to win their lawsuit and were able to provide settlements for a number of households. Obviously not as many as we would have hoped, but at least the precedent was set that FEMA couldn't discriminate against these households. Through a case study award from the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, my group conducted an analysis of this lawsuit, which we're currently developing into an article that's under revision at JAPA. But through the lawsuit, we saw 2 key issues emerge in FEMA's relationship with low-income communities, particularly low-income communities of color in the US, Black and/or Latinx communities. First is this idea that they're instituting what I refer to as a territorialization of poverty. In other words, it's almost like geographic reification of the race and economic class issues across communities of color. And this was done in a very specific way. It kind of helps to illustrate what I mean by territorialization of poverty. So following Hurricane Dolly, following any disaster, specifically, FEMA sends trained home inspectors to go and assess damage on homes to see if that damage is eligible for individual and households program funding. What happened after Dolly is that before the inspectors even got to the region, there were not enough inspectors within the Rio Grande Valley, so they had to pull from other parts of Texas. These individuals were unfamiliar with the valley, and so they were given maps to show where different areas were in the valley as a whole. These maps actually called out the hyper low income communities I mentioned were called colonias. They actually physically showed where these communities were. And so the net result of this is that when low income residents interacted with these inspectors, because the inspectors could see the home was in a hyper low income area, they didn't even approach the household or the house. They just sort of drove by in their car, and then the family received a rejection notice a few days later. And so there was a lot of very antagonistic interactions that these residents experienced because of this sort of calling out of these hyper-impoverished areas. And the main reason for this antagonism was that not only were the inspectors given these maps, but they were told to expect deferred maintenance in these areas. So deferred maintenance is essentially a term that is used by FEMA to reject a household, denying them any funding through the IHP program. But it's not actually defined in the program, and that was sort of the linchpin of the lawsuit, is that this term was used to reject a high number of applications, but is not actually defined in FEMA's program. But using a different program that FEMA runs, their public assistance program, which helps to rebuild government buildings after disaster, we can see that deferred maintenance is essentially damages on a home that can be attributed to lack of maintenance, not the disaster itself, for which FEMA will not repair. So FEMA is not going to repair a roof that clearly has damages that were not caused by the disaster. They only want to fund disaster-related damage. So herein lies the second issue. Because deferred maintenance is not well defined in the individuals and households program, it's oftentimes a term that's implemented differentially across different communities, particularly along race and class lines, is what our initial research is starting to show. So communities of color often have non-dominant, housing and urbanization types. They are very distinct and different from other spaces in the US, particularly in the Valley. They have their own urbanization practices. And we believe that this is what is causing them to be unfundable in FEMA's eyes. So we're very concerned about how this policy is being implemented, its lack of definition. There are other scholars in the US like Andy Rumbach and Esther Sullivan who are also looking at similar issues, but in relation to mobile home communities in the US. So my core question here is how this case, while different than Puerto Rico's case, might help elucidate other aspects of disaster colonialism that are being put into practice outside of Puerto Rico. And so just as a summary, the Valley has a long history of storms, as I mentioned, and has experienced several summers over the last few years of really intense tropical storms and flooding. So they have this issue of repeated disaster. And what we're seeing in looking not just at Dolly, but other historic storms in this region, is that they also have this issue of repeatedly slow disaster response, similar to what we see in Puerto Rico. So the question that we have now is how these compounding disasters in the Valley are entrenching dispossession in the region, which has long been neglected, not just by the federal government, but also the state of Texas. And so this is sort of where we're at with this case and trying to understand how it might be similar or dissimilar to what we've been seeing in the US and what that might mean for other communities across the US. So just real quick to recap, these are three of the questions that I posed at the end of my IGER piece that I thought might be nice as sort of a conclusion for the talk today. So the first question I posed, and this is really, trying to understand disaster colonialism beyond Puerto Rico and seeing it potentially in other communities, three questions that we should ask ourselves. So first, if not for the disaster, would the phenomena taking place be usefully considered settler colonialism or some other kind of colonialism or post-colonialism? To me, this speaks to the need to merge research and activism on environmental justice and environmental racism with disasters and understanding how those two issues begin to intersect. Second, in regions marked by frequent disasters, how might the history of recurring disaster be used to entrench racial violence and dispossession? So how can we shift from seeing disasters as events to seeing disasters as constitutive of structural inequities? And this speaks to me of that idea of procedural vulnerability that I mentioned earlier. How do we see that at play in different communities, and how does that affect different peoples? And then lastly, with increasing numbers of disasters due to climate change, how might disaster colonialism develop? How do ahistorical views of disasters distort the issues at hand by downplaying the survivance of communities, or worse, centering the issues on the communities themselves? And again, with repeated disasters, we have the danger of blaming relational inequities that are generated from these compounding disasters on the communities themselves, as opposed to the structures that surround their recovery and redevelopment. And this is an issue that we saw on the Gulf Coast this last fall. The Gulf Coast of the US was hit by 3 hurricanes, almost in rapid succession. And we're very concerned about what that means for the communities in coastal Louisiana and Mississippi moving forward. So I just wanted to close with a reminder from Neil Smith that disasters don't simply flatten landscapes, washing them smooth. Rather, they deepen and erode the ruts of difference, social difference that they encounter. So with that, I think that's a good stopping point. I'd be happy to take questions and open it up for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Danielle. And I was remiss in my introduction. I got so excited about sort of the topic that I missed. You had to. I had all these plans to talk about the Just Environments Lab and sort of the context in which you're working at the moment. So, thank goodness that you put that in, because it was. I meant to do that. But I'm really glad. Please do follow these links. The online presence is really wonderful, and because of your training, the maps that you present are gorgeous. So that's
yeah, I think maybe that second slide is also a preface to, I was trained as a designer, so we are a bit, meticulous about how we represent some of these issues.
As well you should be. It's good. So please, for those assembled, please, if you would, in the parlance of Teams manners, would you just raise your hand there, and we'll get to questions from the assembly. Anybody? The floor is open. Yes, Mary, go for it.
Great, thanks. Let's see what happens if I make myself visible. Oh, okay. I have a bad line, so if everything cracks up, I'll stop. Thank you so much for a really interesting talk. Is very, very thought-provoking. I started to think about my own experiences at the other end of the country in Alaska, and I think these ideas of procedural inequity, the way that the system doesn't really have the capability to understand or to have the right boxes to tick for people and communities that live at the extremes of the bell curve of how people live. And my own thoughts were sort of simple things like the Alaskan insurance and issues dealing with damage if your house is not built to a building code, which many houses in Alaska aren't. And more particularly, the extraordinary story, which I don't know if you know about, written in a book by called The Firecracker Boys by Dan O'Neill, where back in the 40s and 50s, to be sure, 50s, the Atomic Energy Authority, as it then was, looking for peaceful ways to use atomic energy, decided they would blow a hole in coastal Alaska. The thought being, well, nobody lives up there. And it seems to me that this is not necessarily disaster response, but it shows that sort of organizations and federal government and rules don't take into account how people live at the extremes. And I just wondered whether you thought that was that resonates with what you're seeing, or whether that's perhaps too simplistic a view.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I think, certainly you bring up a very important point. This issue of housing quality specifically in the U.S., we have an issue, and I think this is for me very marked because I work at the U.S.-Mexico border, so I can see, just a stone's throw away, Mexican housing policy versus the U.S.'s, and the U.S.'s policies are very stark. Either things are in compliance and 100% meet all building codes, all regulations, all health policies, or they're missing compliance with any one of those and are suddenly entirely illegal in nature. And that becomes so marked when we talk about disaster recovery, especially the individuals and households program I mentioned, are very concerned if a house is perceived, not even actually in violation, but perceived to be in violation of a building code or a zoning law, they will actually be denied assistance. And that's one of the issues that we saw after Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. And I've also seen that play out in the hyper low income communities in the US-Mexico border region. And so part of the work that we're doing is also to understand how poverty and this idea of household maintenance also function within these systems as well. And so I've heard of similar issues. I've never worked in Alaska myself, but I've heard of similar issues out there where there is a lot of poverty, particularly in the rural areas. And so when something does happen, those whole households have trouble getting aid because their homes are seen as being illegal in some way. It's also caused problems just in general trying to improve the communities in the US-Mexico border region. Whenever we touch a home as architects, suddenly we have to bring that home up to 100% compliance, and it becomes extremely expensive to improve anything in this context. If you want to just make a small improvement to help their, improve their quality of life, suddenly you have to redo the entire house in some way. And if they have foundation issues, I mean, you're going all the way down into the ground and having to rebuild from scratch. And so this issue is very prominent and it comes up over and over again. I'd say definitely I see some of the issues I mentioned in terms of disaster colonialism, or maybe it's more along the lines of that idea of environmental colonialism mentioned by people like Carmen Concepcion in Alaska. And so especially when you go to the northern reaches of Alaska, there's that tension between the indigenous groups there and also oil interests, which has really been coming to a head in US in the last few years. And so, I don't know as much about the context, but from what I understand, there seems to be something there as well. And it may have to do, with that being a liminal space, as you mentioned, as being seen as this exceptional space. We're all the way up in the Arctic Circle, so far away from the rest of the mainland US. It allows those kinds of conflicts to occur.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Oh yeah, I apologize if you want to ask a question. I can only see one person at a time. Actually, I could stop my share. Oh, I think you're muted, Eli. So sorry.
Sorry. If any others from that's my mistake. Any others from the floor? Because if not, I will have one. So my question, and others can raise the hand while I'm asking this one, but I was wondering if something that I've been thinking about in since your work sort of intersects with Naomi Klein's, and we discussed that a little bit when we spoke with her sort of follow-up book, but I was wondering if, and this is more oblique, but coming into the Puerto Rico work, are you seeing evidence of a shift toward privatization, or like an increased role in privatization of disaster response? And because you said that one of the things that happens in Puerto Rico is like the U.S. has this very long track record of like trialing new ideas, and so one of those, I've been thinking a lot about sort of the cost of disaster events, economic costs, to be specific, not human lives, but or not directly, but sort of the economic measurements of a disaster impact. And I was wondering if you were seeing sort of part of that privatization story in Puerto Rico in the work that you've been doing.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a lot of Puerto Ricans would say, there's this long history of privatization of public services on the island. Early ideas of neoliberalism in the U.S. were tried out and trialed on the island before they were brought to the rest of the U.S. And so there's always been this history of messing with, public-private partnerships, or going, completely private for different services. In particular, I can think of in housing, very, very early in the 1950s, that idea of self-help housing, which you can find elsewhere in Latin America, actually began in Puerto Rico and then went into Latin America. So it's that idea that if the poor want to have better housing conditions, they have to build it for themselves. And so they're given maybe the resources to build their home, but they have to do it themselves. And that was such an early idea in Puerto Rico that then gets transferred elsewhere. So I think there really is that long history of privatization that you were mentioning, especially through neoliberalism. And so I think what's interesting to me, I'm happy you brought this up, because one thing that we saw in Puerto Rico is, knowing that they've always been this test bed for early ideas before they're kind of enacted elsewhere. In 2017, a lot of Puerto Rican organizations were warning people in the US that the response they received after disaster could easily be replicated in the rest of the US. And what we see now with COVID is a lot of the same issues with the previous administration. They did, a lot of the same tactics that were employed after Maria in Puerto Rico, we see happening to the whole of the US with COVID. And so I think Puerto Ricans always try to like wave the flag and say, hey guys, like something bad's going on here. Like you really need to pay attention to this. Sometimes they're listened to, unfortunately, sometimes they're not. And after Maria, I don't think a lot of people took Puerto Ricans seriously when they said this could happen elsewhere.
Well, I believe you. I think you make a very strong case. So I'm excited. I'm excited to see, more work keep continuing to come out, and it's time for your second cup of coffee for the morning, I think, and I just want to thank you for joining us today. It's been great to have you.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming and for hearing about my research.
Well, we will be in touch. So
yes, certainly. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.